This week on Quadriga, re-importing terror, big threat for Europe? Thousands of foreign jihadists, many of them from Europe, are fighting alongside IS forces in Syria and northern Iraq. Why do young Europeans head off to fight in a religious war? And how do they become radicalised? Intelligence services warn that those who return from the battlefield could pose a threat to public safety in the EU. How serious is the threat of re-imported terrorists? And how should Europe react to this perceived danger? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. One of the men implemented in the beheading of two American journalists himself appears to be potentially one of those foreign jihadists. How should the rest of the world be responding? That's what we want to talk about today with three people who've been following events in the Middle East very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Malte Lehming. He's the opinion page editor of the Berlin-based newspaper Der Tagesspiegel, and he has also served as the paper's Washington bureau chief and as its foreign editor, covering the security issues, transatlantic relations, and the Middle East. Abdel-Samad is with us again. He's a freelance writer and journalist who's made a name for himself as a critic of Islam. The son of an Egyptian Sunni imam, he moved to Germany at the age of 23. And it's a pleasure to welcome Asiem Difraoui, senior fellow at the Berlin-based Institute for Media and Communication Policy. The Paris-based political scientist and documentary filmmaker has published widely, among other topics, on jihadis. I'd like to ask all of you to start out by assessing how grave this threat really is. And by the way, when we talk about ISIS today, I think we will use the term ISIS. They themselves are sometimes now calling themselves Islamic State, but let's perhaps stick with ISIS just for clarity's sake. Malte Lehming, what would you say? Has the beheading of the two American journalists and the threat, or one British, one American journalist, and the threat to behead yet another change the calculus here?
That's a good question. I don't know whether it changed the calculus. I mean, the threat was there before, and the war was going on. Some even genocides or even grave acts of terrorism had been committed. So it just added to these horrors that had been before. I mean, the beheadings are a signal against, first of all, the President of the United States, because either he looks weak in not reacting, or you pull him in again into Iraq and Syria and all this mess like before, and that didn't come out very good for the United States or the rest of the world in Europe. So that's the tool they are using right now. It's a terrible tool, but I think the Christians, the Yazidis, and all other people down in that region, it's happening to them every day. Things like that.
Asiem Difraoui, the man responsible for the beheadings, or at least one of the people mainly responsible, has a very strong British accent, appears possibly to be a British national. How should the rest of the world be responding to that? And would you say that that's an indicator that we really are facing a very serious threat in our own countries in the West?
Yeah, you're asking a twofold question. Are we facing a threat here? So far, the Islamic State, in quotation marks, was concentrating on expanding territory and controlling territory, which is quite new for jihadi movements. I mean, successfully holding territory, and they were not going for this global jihad. Due to the American intervention, all this might shift very quickly. In a sense, the threat is real, as the Islamic State, in quotation marks again, has the highest number of foreign recruits which we have seen so far for a jihadi movement. The total number of European, I've had last estimates yesterday, is exceeding 2,000 young Europeans. So obviously, if the leadership of ISIS is deciding to start revenge attacks, there's a huge potential of sending some people back to Europe, and which are totally able and trained to do attacks. Let's hope that most of them are known, that the European Security Service will be able to filter people who are coming back, but we cannot be sure.
Hamad Abdel-Samad, isn't the primary goal of ISIS at the moment a geographical and political goal rather than exporting jihad back to the West as perhaps, say, Al-Qaeda wanted to do? Isn't there a very different motivation that is leading these men to go to Syria and Iraq to fight on the side of ISIS?
Both sides belong together. I would like to disagree with Asiem that they are not planning to expand outside their territories. No, they are planning to do that on the long term, and that's what makes them attractive also for young European radical Muslims who want to join this group because it has a global dimension. This young guy who beheaded the American journalist is expected to be a British citizen of Egyptian origin. And this message sent by this scene to young radical Muslims in Europe is a very dangerous message. And here why I see a new dimension in this brutality, because he's becoming like a role model. In Europe, I was weak, I was nobody, and now I'm extremely strong. I'm like God. I decide if somebody will die, or I'll decide if somebody will stay alive. This gives many young radical Muslims an option for behavior in their life who feel like nobody in Europe, and that's why I see the global dimension.
Let me continue a little on your first remark. Obviously, all kind of jihad has a global dimension, but then a lot of jihadis can make a local choice. So ISIS initially was really concentrating on the local jihad. I mean, liberating territories liberating, again in quotation marks, in Syria and Iraq. Then again, the global dimension comes in as a strategic shift in reaction to American involvement, in reaction to European involvement against the ISIS threat. And then again, you made a very valid remark about ultra-violence. That's something really new in terms of jihadi movements, that we have European executioners, murderers, who serve as model, who serve as an example for other Europeans. And ISIS is really living through ultra-violence. Military success and ultra-violence attracts a lot of European recruits, which makes the movement quite dangerous.
Malte Lehming, initially, some months back, clearly security services in the U.S. were downplaying the potential of ISIS to be a very serious threat. I think at one point President Obama said, look, they can put on the uniforms of professional athletes, but that doesn't make them a world-class team. Now we're hearing from Prime Minister David Cameron in Britain, this is an extremely grave and deep threat, greater to our security than any we've ever known. What changed?
I'm not sure if it's the gravest threat that we've ever known, but it is really a grave threat. It's a grave threat for people living there. I mean, we saw, first off, the first group that was pointed at was Christians, then the Yazidis, and then Sunni themselves, who were not as radical as these groups are. So if it started in Syria and now spills over to Iraq, we have a number of states. Look to Jordan. How stable will Jordan be? Look to Lebanon. How stable will Lebanon stay? And supported by Iran through Iraq, through all this. So there is a potentially very, very unstable geographical area there right now, which even seems that the national state seems to be in danger.
People have been writing about the end of Sykes-Picot, the end of this colonial artificial borders. Interestingly enough, that's really one of the main declared objectives of ISIS, to say, we'll end Sykes-Picot, we'll end this artificial colonial states and create through our caliphate, a traditional, traditional Sunni heartland, and this makes it very, very attractive for many people. So that's,
I know, but the basic question is, I mean, since Sykes-Picot clearly sets artificial borders, but I would say that 90% of all borders in the world are artificial, and set at one time or another by a certain outcome of a war or something else, and so on. So the problem is people have to learn to live in a not ethnical cleansed state. I mean, to go away from Sykes-Picot means we need to have ethnically defined states. And the modern concept of state is you have to live together with other states.
Germany couldn't live with Germany reunited as well. If we talk, for instance,
we have a Danish minority in Schleswig-Holstein sitting in the parliament.
I'm not saying that ISIS aims are appreciable, you know. But I mean, like, if you look at some kind of Sunni heartlands, like in Iraq and Syria, Mosul was traditionally much closer to Syrian cities like Aleppo than to Baghdad, and vice versa. So obviously there is a desire of those populations to reunite in some form, so which is exploited by ISIS.
Let me bring it back again now to the question of the foreign jihadists. Ahmed Abdel-Samad, I know that you were once a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but now you say it is an organization that is absolutely fascist in nature. Describe for us, if you would, please, what is the attraction for these young men? You touched upon it before. What draws them there, and what might we do to draw them back?
Yeah, those people are attracted to imaginary identity, and that's exactly what those groups, no matter if it's the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafist group, or ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they give them the impression there is a global Islamic identity which is not committed to their national borders. The national states couldn't offer those young people a stable identity so that they can feel home. Then they feel weak, they feel insecure in their identity, and they need an imaginary identity that they are a part of a great project. And that's how these radical groups work. The Muslim Brotherhood is the mother of all Islamist organizations who came later. The thoughts of Sayyid Qutb, one of the thinkers of the Muslim Brothers, are the things which are quoted now, that we tried everything else. We tried capitalism, we tried communism, we tried nationalism, and it didn't work out, and we couldn't establish strong Islamic states. Why don't we go back to our origin? Why don't we establish a state just like the Prophet did 1400 years ago? And that's exactly what ISIS is doing. It's carrying the same flag the Prophet was carrying. It's leading the same wars, wants to purify the Arab countries from everything which is not Islamic, and is therefore becoming brutal against minorities like Christians or Yazidi or others.
I can't let this stand that way. In a sense, we can't throw the Muslim Brotherhood, which can be at times authoritarian, but there are also political Islamic movement belonging or close to the Muslim Brotherhood, which have quite a sense of democracy, or at least in terms of popular participation.
What do you mean by democracy? What do you mean by democracy?
At least popular participation. So let's not throw everybody into the same basket. But then again, I agree. The charm of ISIS and this jihadi organization is that they're sects. They're really sects. And sects which carry huge promise, especially jihadi movements, have this really salvation promise, a salvation myth, which makes it so attractive. Join us and you'll go to paradise. Join us, become a suicide terrorist, and you'll have immediate access to paradise. So the whole salvation myth of those groups is a very, very big danger, especially for Western youth. A lot of increasingly the Western youth that is recruited there has social problems, sometimes has a criminal background. I mean, recruitment to Salafism, jihadism in prisons in France and increasingly so in Germany and Great Britain is quite high. So they have this promise of paradise to offer. Join us and we forget what you did before. Join us, and they go very high. The salvation myth is one of the major threats. If you join us, and we'll forgive your sins, and you have immediate access to paradise. So
but they go even beyond that, and that until that Al-Qaeda was using this strategy. They were recruiting suicide bombers who will go soon to paradise. But ISIS is also offering a paradise on earth. It's offering success in this life. Come to us, you don't have to die. But in a way, yes, you have a win-win situation. You have a win-win situation. Either you will win the war with us, so you will be financially and politically successful in this life, or you die, then you go to paradise.
I wanted to say, apparently, Malte Lehming, ISIS is also offering quite a bit of money. The recruits who join ISIS apparently are promised quite good salaries for their efforts. And we are told that there are a number of soldiers who were trained in Germany, in the German armed forces, who are actually now heading to fight side by side with ISIS, partly for financial reasons.
Yes, I mean, clearly we have to look at, we have two different kind of groups. We had the cell in Hamburg responsible for 9/11. They were mostly foreigners living mostly isolated in Hamburg. Now we have the jihadis. They are coming, they have German passports, most of them are born in Germany, or even Germans, some of them are convertites. So basically what motivates them, none of us knows. Maybe it's attraction of Islam, maybe it's money, maybe they have their own psychological problems. Nobody really knows. We have no study about what motivates young jihadis to go there. I very much doubt it's from social classes. We have rich people, we have poor people, we have educated people and non-educated people. So very, very different. The problem and the threat is that they have our passports, they speak our language, and if they come back, they have the experience of war. They've seen brutality, they've seen blood, they've seen murder, and they're living side by side in us now in Hanover, in Munich, or in a small town in Bavaria. What do you think? I mean, you have thousands of reintegrating programs for regular soldiers in countries like United States, Great Britain, even in Germany, dealing with post-traumatic syndrome, dealing with all the stress from war times. And even though you have these programs, you have psychological, many problems, like suicide rates, like going amok and things like that. It is a huge problem. Now you have young people with the experience of brutal war in Syria coming back at home. This is causing a huge threat.
Let's talk right away about how to respond, but perhaps first take a brief look at what we've seen of a response so far. If you remember, when President Obama ordered the airstrikes, it was as a very limited reaction. He described it basically as a means of preventing genocide against the Yazidis and also of protecting American diplomats in the Kurdish regional capital, Erbil. Has the threat now altered to the point that the response should be considerably different?
Thousands of refugees are fleeing the IS. Amnesty International has accused the jihadists of systematic ethnic cleansing. Large numbers of Yazidis and other minorities have been abducted and possibly murdered. The list of those missing grows longer each day.
The IS militants came and separated the women and children from the men. They killed all the men and took all the women and children to Tal Afar.
The Sunni jihadists have vowed to kill everyone they view as infidels. And proof that they simply execute many of the people they abduct is mounting.
This is not some foreign conflict thousands of miles from home that we can hope to ignore. The ambition to create an extremist caliphate in the heart of Iraq and Syria is a threat to our own security here in the UK.
European governments are now increasing efforts to stop the flow of jihadists from Europe to war zones in the Middle East.
Most of all, we need international cooperation, in particular with countries such as Turkey, but also within the European Union.
Asiem Difraoui, you were starting to say we do know something about the motivations for foreign jihadism. What do they tell you about how we in the West should be responding to this problem? Is it, in essence, a military issue, or is it a political issue, a policing issue? What's the best response here?
It's both. It's everything. To respond to jihadism, you need to give some societal answers. You have to give some social answers, and obviously there's also a military response. In terms of radicalization, I mean, there have been studies, many studies about why people would become jihadis. But what all the studies show, that there's no single determining factor why people become jihadis. I mean, it's really multifold. There are various reasons, but one of them in Europe is definitely, for example, alienation from European society and a search for meaning. So we have studies, and we have to give if we look at the current situation in Syria and in Iraq, a military and a security response, but we also need to give responses on the social level with prevention programs all around Europe, with de-radicalizing programs all around Europe. I mean, Germany is on the forefront. The Germans are quite good for a couple of years. They have really investing times and energy and money in civil society initiatives, in grassroots initiatives. There's still a lot of work to do in order to prevent radicalization. But there needs to be a common European approach and a huge debate in European societies of how to prevent this radicalization. And we have, for instance, very little cooperation on the level of radicalization prevention, while we have more and more security cooperation, obviously, in Europe. But only security cooperation is not the answer.
Hamid Abdel-Samad, staying with that question of prevention and policing, we saw Prime Minister Cameron speaking there. He's pushing hard for much tougher measures now in Britain, even returning to something called control orders. That was a form of house arrest for people who were thought to be potential jihadists. Also talking about taking away the passports of people who either are returning from the Middle East and might be potential jihadists, or for those who might want to go. What do you think about that? Is that not perhaps undermining the very thing we believe we stand for in the West?
No, I think it's trying to recorrect the mistakes that a country like Great Britain did in the past. Let's look at the guy who is supposed to be the one who beheaded the American journalist James Foley, or the two journalists now. He is having Egyptian origin. His father came as asylum seeker to Great Britain. Everybody knew he is a fundamentalist, but he was granted asylum. And a few years later, he joined Al-Qaeda and became one of the most effective lieutenants.
Yes, I just Britain goes from one extreme to the other.
Okay, one moment.
Let me finish.
Samad finish.
And in the name of tolerance, Great Britain was opening its arm for those people because it thought they are persecuted in their own country and we need to give them a shelter. But didn't have an eye on them and let them build up a fundamentalistic infrastructure, which is the worst in Europe right now. There are certain provinces or certain suburbs in London and some other cities that you as a European cannot walk there because they are controlled by Islamists and Islamic rules are valid there. And this young man, so now we have a case of homegrown terrorism and imported terrorism. And that's what should be thought about when we are thinking about solutions. When those people are coming back, everybody's saying like they need psychologists and then they need some therapies. No, they are criminals. They are terrorists. They should be dealt with as criminals in the first place. But then that doesn't mean that the prevention shouldn't go forward. You have been talking about successful prevention in Germany. How do you calculate that?
We have successful. I said Germany is working.
Did a good job in that. But when we see how many the number of Salafists is growing in Germany, we have 400 or more fighters, German fighters in Syria, and we have more people who are sympathizing with them here. It means this kind of grassroots initiatives until now didn't show that it's effective enough.
It didn't prove the contrary, but at least something is done. But coming back to Britain, Britain had a very particular approach. True enough, London was called for a while Londonistan, as a lot of jihadis returning in the 90s from Afghanistan could speak freely, could create networks. Among them, the father of the supposed beheader of the American journalist. Now, after the tube bombings in 2005, Britain reversed course and took extremely radical measures to combat jihadism. More extreme than all European countries. The legendary British freedom of speech went away. They even punished people for just possessing jihadi propaganda. I mean, which radicalized people further in a sense. There was the famous case of a young girl, a young lady, who wrote a poem a poem in the glory of bin Laden and got a jail sentence for it. So they pushed it very far. I fear taking more security measures, more repressive measures, also can create the inverse effect and radicalize people further. So there needs to be very, very carefully sort of balance between prevention, repression, legislation frameworks. So there's always a risk if you go too far, you radicalize people further, you alienate them further from society.
Malte Lehming, weigh in here on this, if you would, please. Britain has now raised its anti-terror warning to the second highest level. Should Germany do the same? It has nearly the same number of nationals fighting on the side of ISIS.
Right now, as far as I can tell, I mean, all of the informations are with the secret services and places like this, and they say no right now. And my job as a citizen is to believe them. I have no special information about how huge the threat is. I mean, first of all, it clearly has to be said the biggest threat from ISIS is right now coming from minorities in the region themselves. They're killing them by thousands every day. So we are talking kind of a luxury threat that we are in. We are in a real threat. But it's right now they have not committed any kind of terrorism here. First of all, I would say yes, we have tools. We could label ISIS a terrorist organization. We have not done that yet. We should do, like Al-Qaeda, like Al-Nusra Front, like everything else, so that even joining them is a criminal act. That if you travel there to fight, you are, and I agree with Hamid, you are a criminal, you're doing criminal acts. By coming home, meaning you're going to jail if you join them. That means joining a terrorist organization. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that ISIS is a terrorist organization.
What about flows of money? What could be done to shrink the flows of money to ISIS? We have heard that ISIS is one of the richest terrorist organizations there has ever been. What can be done there?
That's the whole discussion we have to have very open in the West, because we didn't have it right now. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all these states, they have a kind of a double game. Some of the muftis, some of the people are condemning ISIS, saying even this is kind of a threat, but in the countries themselves and in finance flows and everything else, they are supporting. Support is coming out of these states to these organizations. So that is a real problem that we have with these, especially these two countries.
Asiem Difraoui, you're shaking your head. We're told that people in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, two of the closest allies of the West, are very much part of the funding stream to ISIS.
Yeah, obviously, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, wealthy businessmen funded a lot of jihadi movements historically. The Saudis have done a lot to curb it. Whether really successful, we don't know. But I mean. But the real issue is, especially in terms of ISIS, they don't need Qatari and Saudi money anymore. There's self-financing, and that's where the real issue is. Saudi Arabia is so afraid from ISIS, they're really controlling money flows there. But they control the oil fields, they control even flows of agricultural products. A year ago, or 2 years ago, a Syrian opposition figure was showing me a map of Syria, explaining those people will control in the future that, and that's where the money comes from really export taxes, from oil, from even the huge agricultural product. So ISIS is doing very well in self-financing it as a state, as they declare. And now we won't be able to limit their access to money if we don't defeat them militarily over there.
Abdel-Samad, I'd like to come to the military question now. I was in the United States when the first beheading was announced of the American journalist, and it certainly changed the tenor of the discussion there. We saw very, very strong criticism from conservatives, for example, from the U.S. Senator and former presidential contender John McCain, who said, we need a much more robust military response to this threat. On the other hand, some are arguing, for instance, one of the main New York Times editorialists, Tom Friedman, saying all of this is guaranteed to provoke a hasty military response on our part. That is exactly what they're looking for, and it would be a huge mistake. What do you say?
Yeah, what should we do? I mean, those people are criminals who are killing people who want to have genocides. They are dismissing Yazidis and Christians from their cities and villages. What should be the proper response? If you will do nothing, their power will increase, and they will pose a much greater threat in the future. I think
should the West bomb Syria?
They should not.
In Syria, ISIS?
I think they should not only bomb, they should also send ground troops to Syria and to Iraq, because the Kurds alone cannot stop these growing armies, which are very vital and very dynamic, and they are gaining territory, money, and oil fields day after day. And we have been talking about Great Britain that at the beginning was too much tolerant and easygoing in dealing with terrorism. I'm saying always a stitch in time saves 9. If we act in the right time, then we don't have to do a lot. If the United States had the right strategy in Iraq after the war, we wouldn't have been here yet. But under the pressure, everybody was saying the United States has to... Everybody was criticizing the United States for having troops in Iraq. Okay, Bush did a great mistake, we agree upon that. But those who have been pushing the United States to leave Iraq, what are they having now?
Iraq itself was pushing the United States to leave. Malte Lehming, Western ground troops are obviously not going to be going into this conflict. But there is a lot of pressure for a wider military response, as I say, possibly bombing ISIS positions within Syria. That would take this to quite a different level, would it not? Is there a military solution to this conflagration across the Middle East?
In an ideal world, if you could send, for example, ground troops to there from America, or even from Arab states, why not from Saudi Arabia and Qatar? If they are so declaring themselves to be an enemy, why don't they fight?
That's one of the options under discussion at the moment.
On the discussions, I doubt that this is a realistic option. I doubt the most realistic option right now is containment. So you have to arm the Kurds in the north, you have to look for stability in Jordan, you have Turkey on the flank, you have somehow to contain the ISIS with military terms in just, giving the right weapons to the right people right now.
Your government decided, the German government decided this week to send arms to the Kurds, a rather unusual decision in this country, which tends to stand back from involvement in military conflicts. How concerned are you that that decision could provoke exactly the kind of returning jihadism that we've been talking about, provoke some of those German nationals in the conflict to come back here with bomb vests on?
I'm not afraid about that. The jihadis who are going to Iraq or Syria to fight there, they don't need extra motivations to kill people in Germany. So they will always find an excuse, if they want some, to be radical if they are here. But sending weapons is not the extra thing that motivates them to be a real terrorist. I don't think that.
Asiem Difraoui, would a military defeat, let's say there were stronger action perhaps by a combination of Western forces together with some from neighboring states and the Kurdish forces strengthened, if ISIS were to see serious defeats, would that likely provoke more jihadis to return here? Could defeat be counterproductive, in other words?
No, but there's always a risk if you have a defeated army that you have returning soldiers who create havoc somewhere, that's the history of wars, But there's another very, very important issue. Maybe ISIS isn't that militarily strong. Maybe the symbolic defeats will also take away a lot of recruitment. Then again, there's a huge political agenda to follow in order to defeat ISIS. We shouldn't forget that ISIS would have never taken a city with much more than 1 million inhabitants like Mosul, a very important historical city, without creating very powerful local alliances. Local alliances with huge Sunni tribes, local alliances with ex-Ba'athist, pro-Saddam confederations. Again, Mosul is a very good example. Mosul was a recruitment ground since the Ottoman Empire for Iraqi army officers. The traditional Iraqi military comes out of Mosul. So those people allied themselves with ISIS for obvious political reasons. But those people, if we incite them, if they find their place in Iraq, or now Shia-dominated Iraq, might also defect in a split second from ISIS. We have seen this in 2006 when the Americans won over huge Sunni tribes, the Sunni leaders from Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, which was a predecessor of ISIS. And ISIS, what is now ISIS, nearly collapsed totally in 2006. We might see the same thing if we give political incentives to the Syrian and Iraqi supporters and allies of ISIS. So that's something we should never neglect.
One of the reasons that we're in this mess, you mentioned before, Hamid Abdel-Samad, the mistakes that were made in the past. One of the reasons we're in this mess, of course, is because of the Syrian civil war. The West held back for a very long time from supporting the opposition to Assad precisely because they were afraid that they might wind up supporting fundamentalist Islamists. Yes. If they now go to war against ISIS, the reverse occurs. They are potentially indirectly helping Assad. Is that something we really want to be doing?
No, but it doesn't have to be always the choice between pest and cholera.
Does it not? It looks like that in the Middle East.
It looks like that because we have been waiting too much as this Arab Spring started. It was carried out by mostly secular young people who wanted change. And I said already in 2011 that we need intervention in Syria, and I was the bad guy. But with this mentality, I said a stitch in time saves 9, because we will need a much greater war later if we don't intervene now. The same thing happened in Libya, the same thing happened in Iraq before. It was a great mistake to let things drift away, and we are exactly getting this danger now. We think we will give like some weapons to the Kurds, and we think that will solve the problem and we will be in peace. No, that might delay the problem until, for some reasons, maybe ISIS will take over the Kurdish area and take the same weapons we get, just like they took Mosul, and take the same weapons that the West sent to the Iraqi army before. And that's what makes them strong, what makes us so sure that this will not happen. And the motivation for the Kurds, what motivates them to fight fiercely? They want to have their own state, but Western governments are saying that they don't want to have an independent Kurdish state. Why not? Why don't we open up also these taboo topics? We all want a Palestinian state, but when it comes to Kurdish
states, we should create
states,
the end of Sykes-Picot and not leave it to ISIS. That's what you're saying.
It
Yes.
certainly
We should
looks
open
like
all-
that's what's
yeah.
happening
Yes.
de facto, Malte Lehming. The German government officially still says it doesn't want a separate Kurdish state, but when they arm Kurdish Peshmerga, they are also helping to arm members of the PKK, and that is their avowed aim. Have we, in fact, already given up on some of the ideas of an integrated secular Islam that, or Middle East, that we say we're still clinging to?
I think right now, and maybe you're right, right now many people are giving up on the idea to have a viable two-nation state, Syria and Iraq, in their present borders. This is really, really difficult. And it might take 10, 20 or 30 years. The most likely option is that you have a kind of segregated places there for special ethnic or religious entities.
Lebanon.
Like Lebanon, yeah, like Lebanon. Who
Sounds
is
like a
segregated as well.
recipe for a lot of ethnic cleansing until you get there.
There is a recipe for that too, and I have a little bit to disagree with Ahmed, because we had an intervention in Libya. And look to Libya right now. I mean, they killed Gaddafi, and look at it, it is a mess.
because you didn't do the job until the end. It's
Okay,
always
then we
the
should
same.
have sent ground troops to Libya, then we
Yes.
have to send ground troops to
Yes.
Syria, to ground troops to Iraq. How many ground troops you think will we need to do
This
that?
is the world we are living in, and that's exactly because of lack of balance
but to
between
support-
fighters. You have fighters on the one hand who are ready to die for their cause, who are brutal, and you have the Western civilization that wants to do everything with the hand gloves and without any loss. This is not possible anymore
but
in our
supporting
world.
the secular opposition in Syria against Assad, against Russia, against Iran, against Hezbollah, this is a very tough fight to have.
I'm glad Malte Lehming just mentioned Iran. That's another of the perverse side effects of this entire conflict, Asiem El-Difraoui. The fact that if we were to defeat ISIS militarily and or by other measures, we would indirectly be strengthening Iran.
Yeah, but Iran is already strong enough in the region with all the turmoil going on. I mean, what's long overdue, and every reasonable political analyst would say so, Iran should, for a long time, have been integrated in all the political process, in the diplomatic efforts about Syria and about Iraq. And factually, there will be integrated, and there's a lot of talk behind the scenes. Now, when we're talking about this military solution, and the end of Sykes-Picot and not former borders. There are huge similarities between ex-Yugoslavia and the historical areas of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Ex-Yugoslavia and all the Middle Eastern areas we were speaking about were just badly decolonized from the Ottoman Empire, badly broken up. So there's a real historical parallel there. And what we see today in ex-Yugoslavia might be an example as well. We have ethnic states. We had horrible wars, not one, several, Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, and so on. But today we have the absence of war and a certain reintegration. So maybe this is an example, you know, already let us create the absence of war and then see how those ethnic groups can live together. And I'm very briefly, but I'm not
two or three steps to that, very concrete. What has to happen first?
What people have been for long fire, I mean, integrate even Assad now and say ceasefire. We talk to you if we have an immediate ceasefire in Syria. And then we take it from there. The same for Iraq. The Sunni population of Mosul, we agree on autonomy and a ceasefire, and then we all talk.
Ahmed Abdel-Samad, briefly, would it work?
It's not enough. It's not enough. Those people are burning the country, and they are interested that the fire will continue to go on.
Okay, thank you. Our discussion on this subject undoubtedly will continue to go on in future programs. I thank all of you very much for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.